The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Neer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern and my co-host Dalia Shendlin is off today, but in her stead I am delighted to welcome Harry Rees, currently a Dorot Fellow, and among his many past accomplishments are a stint as the Special Advisor to the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, and a Research Associate to Ambassador Dennis Ross. Welcome, Harry, and thank you for agreeing to co-host.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Our guests today are Associate Fellows at the Hebrew University's Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace. They are long-time collaborators on several studies on the Soviet Union's foreign policy in the Middle East, including their latest book entitled The Soviet-Israeli War, 1967 to 1973, the USSR's military intervention in the Egyptian-Israeli conflict, was recently published in English by Hearst. Isabella Guinaud and Gidon Remez, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, so let's start by describing, Isabella, the atmosphere in the Kremlin in June 1967. Moscow's client states in the Middle East suffer a tremendously humiliating defeat by Israel, who is on the opposite camp in the Cold War. How high on the Politburo's agenda was the dismal result of the Six-Day War?
Well, the Politburo gathered for a meeting on June 5th to 3 o'clock afternoon, and its marathonic sitting have been continued after the war ended already, physically, with the ceasefire. But the Politburo already had decided, especially under Brezhnev's influence, Politburo decided that they have to support the Arab countries who have been defeated in the war because of Soviet standing in their eyes, in the eyes of other countries in the region, and of course because of serious damage that was done to the Soviet weapons, who, according to the Arab countries, were much worse than the American weapons and were the reason for losing the war.
I think it should be emphasized here that Israel at that time didn't have U.S.-made weapons except for the anti-aircraft Hawk missiles, the first U.S. system that was supplied to Israel. And overall, the U.S.-Israeli relationship was nowhere like we're used to thinking about it today. And in general, the superpower-client relationship in the Middle East and elsewhere, but especially here in the Middle East, was very asymmetric. During the Six-Day War, the United States declared and actually practiced neutrality, pulled back the Sixth Fleet from the Eastern Mediterranean and so on. So that for the Soviets, this was a much higher stake than it was for the United States at the time, because the reputation of the Soviet Union as an ally and as a patron was really at stake. As we found in our previous book about the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union had planned it and instigated it together with the Arabs and particularly Egypt. And when the plan went awry, General Murphy intervened. The Israeli preemptive airstrike was a lot more devastating than they had expected. They had a lot to make up for. There were anti-Soviet demonstrations in Egypt which stopped only when a massive airlift from the Soviet Union began. So even before the Six-Day War ended, because the war with Egypt actually ended after 3 days, the Soviet Union had already doubled down on the investment in the Middle East. And
what was it that actually drew them to get, even further bogged down in the Middle East? It was a very unsuccessful escapade. As you said, the Cold War stakes weren't that high because America and Israel weren't that closely related.
They were. For the Soviet Union, they were. They had invested a lot in projecting themselves as the protectors and allies of the so-called progressive Arab countries in the Middle East. And the promises they had given of intervening in their favor in order to tip the balance in the war in the Arabs' favor had gone unredeemed because it became impractical. They had planned a naval landing on Israeli shores, a paratroop drop, aerial bombings of Israeli targets, especially the nuclear complex at Dimona, and so on. And very little of this actually occurred. The Arabs were furious. There were, as I said, there were anti-Soviet demonstrations in Cairo and elsewhere, which stopped only when they saw the Soviet transport planes flying
Soviets wanted to
overhead.
save face.
It was to save face, to save their standing, and also because they had the original purpose of the war at stake.
All right, Isabella, please.
Well, I would like to add that starting with the early 1950s, Israel was considered as a tool in the hands of the United States. And Israel was declared by Khrushchev as a non-viable state. So they couldn't even think that Israel can do by itself something that will go against their plans, their thinking, their presumptive result.
And without U.S. support, which Israel did not have in the Six-Day War.
I want to ask you about that in specific. It emerges from your book that during this time period, contrary to now, Israel seemed to be less fully in the orbit of the United States, and that the Soviets were exercising far more influence in the region than the United States at that time, that they had more skin in the game. Does that accord with how you view it?
Well, the United States had other clients in the state, Saudi Arabia and other of the more so-called conservative Arab countries. But in respect of Israel, definitely after Ben-Gurion was replaced by Eshkol in Israel and after Kennedy sadly was replaced by Johnson in the United States, Israel and the United States were drawing a lot closer. But this still hadn't come to the kind of alliance that we think of today, and certainly not in respect of weapons supply or even of financial aid. So that the United States pressed Israel throughout the crisis of May 67, which was instigated by the Soviet Union in concert with the Arabs, not to shoot first, in fact, not to shoot at all. When the fighting actually began, the United States not only declared neutrality, but actually pulled away from the Middle East and even threatened Israel that if Israel shot first, the United States would intervene in favor of Egypt.
But what was it that motivated the Soviets interventionists, to this great degree, as you describe? Were they thinking about starting like a domino effect in the Middle East, in a non-aligned camp in general? What was the long-term strategic vision?
Well, our first book, is called Foxbats over Dimona. Foxbats are MiG-25s, and Dimona is Israeli nuclear project site. And according even to the very few Soviet documents, we could arrive to the opinion that the war was planned and instigated by the Soviet Union, which was afraid to be circled by the nuclear arms of different states, and especially they suspected that Israel is developing nuclear arms together with the West Germany. And they felt that their window of opportunity is going to close. And they knew that there is some kind of a research and testing and something like that in the Israeli nuclear research project. But apparently, when the Soviet Union got some kind of hint that the window of opportunity is going to close before Israel will obtain nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union got very good information through the Communist Party in Israel that Israel is going to develop atomic weapons and to produce them. They decided simply to put a stop on it.
When they lost the war in 1967, was it still the same trajectory that guided them? Was it curbing Israel at any cost?
No, I don't think so. I think that already they had to curb their losses in the war, especially through their allies, non-Warsaw Pact allies, because Cuba was very much afraid that Soviet Union want to save them if they will be attacked by Americans and other countries, and so on. Well, we cannot know it, but in 1967, Soviet Union brought nuclear submarines, and the submarines whose weapons were nuclear.
When in late 1965, the Soviets received this message from Israel, which was transmitted by former Mossad chief Isser Harel through the communist leader Moshe Sneh to the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv, that despite the ambiguity policy that had already been worked out with the United States, Israel was determined to acquire nuclear weapons. And this was an open question because in the transition from Ben-Gurion to Eshkol, the future of the nuclear project was still unclear. When the Soviets received this, they began a flurry of activity to prevent that happening. First, they tried to blandishments toward Israel. when that didn't work and when there was an outcry from the Arabs, what's this, whose side are you on? They dropped that and concentrated on the military aspect. Now, the Egyptians had been threatening for years to launch a preemptive war if Israel should have nuclear weapons. They asked the Soviets to provide them with countervailing weapons. And the Soviets had already, after their bad experience with China, adopted a very strict non-proliferation stance. They never provided any of their other satellites with nuclear weapons. Instead, they offered the Egyptians in 1966 already a nuclear umbrella, a guarantee against any nuclear attack from Israel. And to enforce it, they stationed nuclear submarines in the Mediterranean and possibly also in the Red Sea, with orders to fire nuclear missiles at Israel under certain conditions, especially if Israel should try any weapons of mass destruction. Now, you may have seen in the recent years, and especially this year, it was reported that in the darkest days of the crisis in May 67, there were proposals in Israel, particularly from Shimon Peres, the father of the Israeli nuclear program, to stage a nuclear demonstration in order to deter the Arabs. And this year it was even disclosed that it was this proposal was to take place inside Egyptian territory in Sinai. That, in our opinion, might well have triggered this Soviet nuclear response that was promised. And so it's very fortunate that the proposal was not adopted. But that this was a central aspect of the run-up to the 67 war has become more and more obvious after years of being downplayed because it was never publicly discussed in Israel.
The picture you paint in the book and now is one of a much more activist Soviet role than what is in the scholarly consensus around the Six-Day War and the period afterward. Can you speak a bit about the methodological issues that you find in the literature and specifically what you call in the book the tyranny of vested interest sources?
Well, there are two aspects to your question. First of all, disintegration of the Soviet Union. The economical situation was so hard that the people who were soldiers, who were conscripted soldiers and served in the Middle East, started to demand to be acknowledged as the veterans of the war, real war, and not simply drafted soldiers. They succeeded in that, and as a part of their struggle was publications. And they published a lot of memoirs, and when we started to see it, first of all, you don't believe it. You know, just when you get a number of 50,000 regular soldiers who passed through the Egypt alone in those years, you don't believe it unless you go and start digging more and gather more and more veterans' memoirs and so on. This is the first aspect of what you asked.
No, because the real issue here is the fact that the archives, the declassified archives of the Soviet Union, we think of the Soviet Union as this, bureaucratic juggernaut, that every little minutia was written down with great accuracy. Well, and as you say in the book, it didn't really serve you as researchers in retrospect.
First of all, the myth that Soviet archives were thrown open after the fall of the Soviet Union was largely myth, even at its best, because the really important archives for our purposes, KGB, General Staff, Presidency, Politburo, were never opened in any systematic fashion. There was disorder and corruption during the Yeltsin years that enabled Western researchers to get their hands on certain parts of it. And there's a lot to be learned from what they did find, but we can't suppose that it's exhaustive enough to be able to draw any conclusions from what they didn't find, because there are so many filters that any event has to pass before you can find it recorded reliably in an archival document, that it's very unlikely that the most sensitive decisions would have passed all of those filters. First of all, it has to be recorded in the first place. And we found, for instance, that Mikhail Gorbachev could never find, and the president of the Soviet Union could not find the original document recording the Politburo decision to invade Afghanistan. So that's one example. The operative resolutions were usually made in informal sessions before they were rubber-stamped in the Politburo. Second, it had to be recorded in an authentic manner rather than skewered, so that if one day it should come to light, it should come to light in the right way. And third, it had to be preserved. And we know from the head archivists of the Soviet Union before and after its decline that millions and millions of files were destroyed, so that we can't learn from it. Now, the you asked about how this tyranny of vested interest sources became so established. The historiographical record was mainly crystallized before there was anything available to historians beyond official declarations, media sources at the time, and the like. And these, of course, were strongly tilted in the direction of the people who initiated them. And on top of that, some of the main actors, and we particularly focus on Mohammad Hassanein Haikal, the Egyptian propagandist on one side, and Henry Kissinger in the United States on the other.
The American propagandist.
No, not propagandist, but definitely very self-seeking. Published memoirs at an early stage before even those documents that did come to light in Western sources were discovered. And as we found, once the documents did become available, many of the concepts that are quoted from one book to the next, but finally you find the original source is either Kissinger or Haikal, are simply false. For instance, just to give one example, if you open any history book, it will tell you that in July 1972, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt suddenly expelled all the Soviet advisors from Egypt because of a rift with the Soviet Union. That, due to Kissinger's détente policy, had refused to give Egypt the offensive weapons to attack Israel in 1973. None of that actually happened. There wasn't a rift. The weapons were supplied, and there was no expulsion of the Soviets from Egypt. And this particular case was inculcated particularly by Kissinger. When you find now both the records of the veterans that Isabella just described, when you find dozens of them that served in Egypt before, during, and after the so-called expulsion, introducing the very weapons that supposedly were denied to Egypt. When you find the Egyptian documents, and here we have an exception because Egyptian archives were never opened, but the Israeli forces did capture a lot of Egyptian documents on the western side of the canal, of the Suez Canal, in the final stages of the Yom Kippur War. And those documents show, by name, the Soviet advisors that remained with the Egyptian units after July 1972 and continued training them for the operation to cross the canal. Then you see that this whole concept of a Soviet-Egyptian rift because of détente in 1972 is simply never happened. And so here, most of the existing scholarship actually leaned on very meager sources, which was what available at the time. We have no complaints about the historians' work. But in the better cases, they said it must be concluded that, it cannot be ruled out that, etc., etc. Yeah. And we found that it must be ruled out now.
I want to ask you about something that emerges in your book and also in historiographical literature, which is the Soviet threat of nuclear use and how that played in the minds of Israeli prime ministers and military leaders. It seemed to be something that was looming on the minds of many, including especially Moshe Dayan.
Can I rephrase that a bit and maybe add to Harry's question? I mean, you're saying obviously that the Soviet Union after the Six-Day War invested a lot of money, weaponry, know-how. I think you said that it was the biggest overseas contingent that the Soviet sent until the invasion of Afghanistan. Is that right?
Outside the Warsaw Pact,
yes. So tilt the strategic balance between Egypt and Israel, and to what extent it did.
For a while.
And following on Harry's question, was it really on the mind of Israeli decision makers? Did they realize that the sea change was happening?
Well, first of all, the Soviet intervention, putting the nuclear issue aside for a moment, the Soviet intervention, particularly in the War of Attrition, 1969-1970, when it reached its peak, with a whole Soviet air defense division stationed in Egypt, most of it along the Suez Canal, Soviet fighter squadrons operating out of Egypt, and a whole range of other units, such as naval squadron based at Egyptian ports, Alexandria, Port Said, and others, Soviet Marines occupying part of the northern part of the Suez Canal, and so on and so forth. This actually determined the result of the War of Attrition, because although the Israeli Air Force is very justly proud of a dogfight on 30th of July 1970, where 4 Soviet-piloted MiGs were shot down and another crashed on the way home, the fact is that at the same time, along the canal, the Soviet-manned SAM-3 batteries were shooting down Israeli Phantom jets at such a rate, and especially Israel was losing the crews for those planes at such a rate that it was unsustainable, and Israel had to accept a ceasefire in August 1970, and what's more, could do nothing about it when the Soviets and Egyptians immediately violated the ceasefire by moving the batteries up to the very canal bank, thus creating a no-fly zone for Israel into Sinai. And this is what actually created the precondition for the Egyptian crossing of the canal in 1973. It was determined almost 3 years in advance.
So you think it should have sent the alarm bells ringing for Israel and it didn't?
They were. But afterwards, in 1972, this so-called rift with the Soviet Union that was so successfully inculcated by Egyptian and Soviet
even in
deception in real time, that a concept took hold in Israel whereby Egypt, without Soviet support and without Soviet offensive weaponry, could not possibly go to war.
And Soviet presence
could not possibly go to war. That, despite the signs being read by Israeli intelligence on the ground, the Israeli military and political leadership simply could not accept that Egypt was indeed determined to go to war and would do so. And it took only a final warning 2 days before the Yom Kippur of 1973 to finally penetrate this so-called concept, the mindset that Israel... Now, about the nuclear issue. It goes back to 1956, the Suez-Sinai campaign, when a nuclear threat from the Soviet Union forced Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw from Egypt. And this is what really accelerated. Britain already had nuclear weapons, but France and Israel did not, to jointly develop a nuclear deterrent so that they could not be blackmailed by the Soviet Union using a nuclear threat. That was the main impetus for the development of the Israeli nuclear project. And this came to a peak, as we said, in 1967. Now, what's really interesting is in the following period, the nuclear issue actually declines in importance for the Egyptians and for the Soviets. When the Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed in 1968, Nasser is in Moscow. Israel, after dithering till the very last minute, finally declines to sign it. They don't take advantage of the opportunity to blast Israel for doing so. And so we have to figure out why this suddenly became a non-issue and why, by 1973, when everyone in the world was already convinced that Israel had deliverable nuclear weapons, this did not deter the Yom Kippur War. And I'll have to refer you to the book for the full answer, but mainly it is that proposal to hold a nuclear demonstration in May or early June of 1967, the fact that it was not implemented, must have proved to the Soviets and Egyptians that so long as there's not a physical invasion of the Israeli heartland, not just a verbal threat, but a physical invasion of the Israeli, Israel does not have the political will to instigate a nuclear first strike. And since, after 67, the Soviet Union openly limited the objectives that it would support for the Arab countries in general and Egypt in particular, only to regaining the territories lost in 67. Up to 67, the Soviet Union had recognized Israel only within the boundaries of the UN partition resolution. That shifted. So they figured that if it was only to get back Sinai, Israel would not respond with nuclear weapons. The problem was with that after the shock of the Yom Kippur War, I happened to be in the command bunker of the Southern Command at Hashiba in Sinai. And at the darkest hour then, 2 nights into the war, when Israel's first counterattack was repulsed with heavy losses, a staff officer says to me, "What's going to happen? We have only 50 tanks left between the Egyptian army and Tel Aviv."
And did Prime Minister Golda Meir contemplate nuclear use during that time?
It has been reported that Israel even made some physical signals, detectable signals, that it might be considering a nuclear strike. So
opening silos.
Things that might be detected by satellites and so forth. And that this was one of the steps that led to the almost nuclear confrontation between the United States, which was already much more aligned with Israel than it was in 67, and the Soviet Union, Kissinger's declaration of DEFCON 3 and the Soviets moving nuclear weapons toward Egypt. So this reached quite a dangerous stage. Fortunately, the Egyptians were halted and the Syrians were repulsed, and this didn't happen. But apparently the calculation that they made, that just full war, an all-out war, but for limited objectives, would not trigger an Israeli nuclear response was somewhat flawed to begin with, and the world had a pretty narrow escape.
Okay, this is, as you said, the sequel to your first book about 1967, or the build-up to the 67 war. Now we're talking about 67 to 73. What can you tell us about your next book, the Soviet intervention in the Middle East after 1973? What was the reaction in Moscow to the results of the 73 war and how it turned out eventually? I mean, we've just celebrated now the 40th anniversary of President Sadat's visit to Israel and the signing of the Israeli-Egyptian peace accord. Was this also, I mean, after 73, was this also a strategic sea change in any way?
We didn't get into this period.
There is a turning point which we have not yet been able to resolve. I don't know if this is going to be our next book, but it definitely demands more attention. And that is what happened a week into the war. Okay, that the Soviet Union, one thing our book, I think, proves definitively, that the Soviet Union was party to the planning of the war and even certain participation in the 1973 war. And everything went to plan until a week into the war, when the Egyptians tried to break out of the no-fly zone that the Soviet missiles had imposed over the Suez Canal and into Sinai, and move forward into Sinai with a mass armored force that created the greatest tank battle since Kursk in World War II, and were beaten back. And ultimately, the Israelis made their counter-crossing of the canal, and the war did not end with a total Egyptian victory. Did they do that on Soviet advice? Did they do that against Soviet advice? And why they undertook such a really foolhardy approach? Because it was doomed as soon as the Israelis had the air superiority. There is a theory that Soviets advised them to do it in order to reduce the pressure on Syria, which was being badly beaten on the Golan Heights. There is a theory that it was done against Soviet advice, and that this is the beginning of the actual rift, not the false illusion of a rift that was made in 1972, but the actual rift that began to open between Egypt and the Soviet Union after 73. What we can say for sure is that one concept of conventional historiography is borne out. The Egyptians, once they had decided to go for a peace agreement with Israel, needed the United States for the peace as much as they had needed the Soviet Union for the war. That because the Soviet Union had ruptured ties with Israel, could not deliver or even broker an agreement with Israel, could not afford the kind of financial aid that the United States was offering, and for a variety of additional reasons, the United States was essential. Now, the Soviets managed to get a ride here into the the Madrid process, the Geneva Convention, conference, and so forth, but they were ultimately more or less dealt out. They're making a comeback now, of course, and with methods, technology, and overall strategy that is strikingly similar to the Soviet one. But nonetheless, they were dealt out for about. The Soviet Union propagandized very strongly against Egypt's separate peace with Israel. There were Soviet plots to assassinate Sadat. It's possible that the one in which Sadat was actually assassinated was done by such strange bedfellows for the Soviet Union as the Muslim Brotherhood. This is just something that has to be checked out yet, but there are KGB documents show that the Soviets were plotting against Sadat. So that definitely there was, as you call it, a sea change in the Soviet-Egyptian relationship, which is just now beginning to be restored with the reactivation of two old Soviet bases in Egypt near the Libyan border, which has been somewhat obscured by the Russian re-entry into Syria, but nonetheless is something we should pay very close attention to.
We've talked about 1967 and we've talked about 1973, but your book is about the years between the war. So I'm wondering if you can set the scene a bit and explain why you focus on the years between the war and how that departs from conventional thinking about events.
Well, as I said, the Soviet veterans started to publish their memoirs, and as they served from the first day of June 67 to 73, you could follow the development of the Soviet incursion into Egypt, actually. And you can follow the development of plans, what to do, how to do it, how to train, and the training itself, and the main personalities, Soviet personalities, who have been responsible for preparing the Egyptian army for the Yom Kippur War. And the same veterans' memoirs also give us names of the people of the Soviet military who were responsible for this training and so on. For example, no document, no intelligence report that had been declassified till now can give us the name of the head advisor or the head person, Soviet military person, who was entrusted with preparing the Egyptian army for the next war. It is General Lieutenant Pyotr Lashchenko. And because his name is very difficult to pronounce and to write down, apparently for the Eastern people, it was never mentioned in any Egyptian or other materials. But what is important is that in addition to his title as a chief military advisor to the Egyptian army, he already in 1967 have been given an additional title as a chief military commander of this group of Soviet forces in Egypt, which means that already in 1967 there were groups from different Soviet military forces that had been under his command. It could be for small groups in the beginning, they grew up, and so on, and at the end get a number of 50,000 Soviet military personnel.
So basically you just took bits and pieces and put them together. Lashchenko, for example, where did his name come from? As you say, he wasn't even mentioned in any of the accounts, the Western accounts before.
By the veterans. Veterans mentioned his name. So some of them who have been much more lower in the pecking order. They even call him our Montgomery because of his military thought and approachment to the military issues. And there are memoirs of other people who have been brought to Egypt immediately, almost after the Six Day War. Most of them have been heroes of Soviet Union in the Second World War, from different kind of military forces like pilots, artillery, communication, and so on. Also, there is a lot of things that we could straighten out from the memoirs, not because they were mistakenly attributed to other things. For example, like in June, in 20th June 1967, the head of state, Nikolai Podgorny, comes to Egypt, and he's supposed, in all books, textbooks, you will read that he brought the chief of staff with him. It's not correct. Well, we discovered the chief of staff with his delegation of about 60 or 70 military personnel arrived in Egypt on 16th of June before. They stayed later than Podgorny.
And that's not merely technical.
It's
because we discovered overall another interesting aspect, that throughout this period, the Soviets and the Egyptians on the one hand and the Americans on the other were each locked into their purposes, which was for the Soviets and the Egyptians, first of all, to score military achievement, to redeem Egyptian valor, Soviet weapons, Soviet reliability, and so on. And the diplomatic maneuvers, which occupy most of the usual histories of this period, supposed peace feelers and negotiations over how the settlement should work and so forth, were mainly a smokescreen for these military preparations.
From the perspective of the Soviets.
Yes, and the Egyptians. For example, in all the material that we've gone over, and we're talking about now hundreds of sources, widespread discussion of preparing the offensive across the canal. There's not a single mention of any preparation for a peaceful crossing of the canal. So while at the diplomatic level, there's much discussion of a possible interim agreement that Israel should withdraw part way, but the Egyptians demanded this be accompanied with a commitment to withdraw fully from Sinai ultimately. And there was a lot of bickering over this. There's no preparation at all of any blueprint, any plan, any training, allocation of forces, etc., for a peaceful crossing. Who's going to cross? How are they going to set up? Will the Soviets be accompanying them? Nothing.
So the 73 war and the great trauma that Israel sustained could not have been averted in any way?
Well, counterfactual history can raise all kinds of possibilities. Suppose Israel had unilaterally withdrawn from Sinai. Okay, that might have precluded the war. It would have taken away the possibility for the Egyptians to score a great military victory, but it would have denied the Soviets the legitimacy they have of repulsing the aggressors. But we found that every time, and being a lefty peacenik in Israeli politics, it would have been much more comfortable from my political outlook to say, well, there was a possibility for peace all the time, and Israel squandered it. But we've actually found no evidence for that. Right. Much has been made of the mission that Sadat sent his envoy, Hafez Ismail, to Washington in 1973 with the peace feelers and so forth. But while Hafez Ismail was amazing the Americans with his first Egyptian peace feeler, Ahmad Ismail, the Minister of War, was shuttling between Damascus and Moscow, coordinating both the 0 hour and the weapons list and the operational plans for the Yom Kippur offensive. And we have found no evidence. We can't say we have found counter-evidence, but we haven't found any evidence that the Egyptians or Soviets really expected any of this to come through. And to get into the minutiae of the discussions between Kissinger and Dobrynin and Kissinger and Brezhnev on this shows actually that the Soviets were constantly adopting the position that we are not going to push the Arabs into a war, but if their demands are not met, we will not be able to restrain them.
No peace, no war.
No. If the Arabs' demands are not met, then we, the Soviets, will not be able to restrain them from going to war. And this amounted basically to an encouragement.
Yeah. All right, Isabella Ginor and Gideon Remez, this is all very interesting, but I'm afraid this is all we have time for. I really strongly encourage our listeners to read your book that is packed with interesting and thought-provoking information about that period. And, of course, it is thought-provoking because, as one reviewer called you, you are truly revisionist, quote-unquote, historians. It's fascinating. Anyway, you are Associate Fellows at the Hebrew University's Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace. And the book we discussed today was The Soviet-Israeli War, 1967 to 1973, the USSR's military intervention in the Egyptian-Israeli conflict. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
Thank you.